Paris Perspective.
Hello and welcome to this edition of Paris Perspective with me, David Coffey. Last week, midterm elections were held across the United States, with observers speculating that the Biden administration would be punished by the American electorate in anticipation of a Republican surge in Congress. Well, the so-called red wave failed to crash on the White House floor, but what exactly does the result mean for US politics ahead of presidential elections in 2024? To unpack what the final tallies actually mean, I'm joined in studio today by Max Dunitz, an activist with France for Bernie, and former left-wing presidential candidate Bernie Sanders, Our Revolution movement. Max, you're very welcome to Paris Perspective today.
Thanks for having me.
Now, let's just start with the figures. We look at the Senate. We've got 48 seats are to the Democrats, 49 seats to the Republican Party. However, 51 seats are needed to have an overall majority. In the House of Representatives, the lower house, we've got 205 sitting with the Democrats, and we've got 217 standing with the Grand Old Party, the Republicans, but you need 218 for a majority. So how will this breakdown affect the Biden administration over the next 2 years?
Well, if Republicans control the House of Representatives, which is not 100% guaranteed because not all the votes have been counted, and because there will be turnover when people, for instance, get better jobs in the private sector or die. We had 5 deaths in the last Congress. So there could be plenty of turnover there, and there could be a bit of chaos in terms of deciding who will be speaker and so forth. But if Republicans control the House of Representatives, we can expect very little legislative victories in the House of Representatives, and we could expect plenty of investigations into the Biden administration, and we will all see pictures of Hunter Biden, unfortunately, that we don't particularly want to see. Then in the Senate, the U.S. media has projected 50 seats for the Democrats, and so far, and there's a runoff election in Georgia. If the Democrats do indeed hold all of these 50 seats when all votes are counted, then it seems that there will at very least be a power-sharing agreement under which Democrats will nominally control the chamber and won't have to all be present every single day. But there will be a lot of deadlock, for instance, when the Judiciary Committee will be split evenly between the two parties, which would really slow down the process for Biden confirming judges, also the process for confirming his appointees. So if the Democrats win this runoff election in Georgia on December 6th, then they would have full control of the other chamber, which would at the very least help with the administration making appointments.
And it wouldn't be a lame duck administration for the last 24 months. Now, former President Donald Trump has been blamed for Republican losses after key candidates that he endorsed in these midterms, well, they lost. He has been described by psychologists as suffering from a narcissistic injury, which is something that apparently people with great media profiles suffer from. But this has, I think one could say fairly enough, been a blow to former President Trump's re-election aspirations. However, the Florida governor, Ron DeSantis, had a resounding re-election, and that was one of the few bright spots one could say was for the Republicans. Can we now expect a larger, more boisterous primary field competing against Trump in 24?
I can imagine that there will be a large, boisterous field. There will be a tough fight for the nomination. To me, it does seem like Ron DeSantis intends to run. Mm-hmm. I would not say that there's a big distinction between Ron DeSantis and Donald Trump in terms of policy. Ron DeSantis has governed very hard on the cultural issues. So, for instance, he has convened so-called experts to determine healthcare for trans people, and these experts included someone described by who's affiliated with a group described as a hate group by the Southern Poverty Law Foundation. So he has used this to deny trans care for all kids and gender-affirming care for adults on Medicaid. So these are extreme positions that
So, I mean, for you and for your, let's say, for Bernie, do you think that DeSantis is potentially more dangerous than Trump's return to the political field? Now, he did get a 20-point victory in Florida. Is he more dangerous, do you feel? Is he more intelligent, less reliant on political rhetoric and rabble-rousing and vindictiveness?
He does he does very much pick fights, but he tends to do it more with the Democrats. For instance, he fired a prosecutor in the Tampa Bay area who said that he would not prosecute abortion, doctors who provide abortion care. This is the sort of thing that would suggest that he'd be very focused on using his power to dismantle a lot of the sort of competent administrative state and use it for partisan aims.
Now, looking at the results from last week's midterms, we can't really call the results a resounding endorsement of Biden's tenure in the White House. How do you, as an activist for Bernie Sanders, view Biden's track record to date?
Well, I would say that this is a big win for the policy of full employment. People have been very sour about the economy in the news media, but when you actually look at the polls, a lot of people are pretty optimistic about their own personal financial situation. They see the high prices as affecting everyone, and they say, okay, the economy's bad, but hey, I was part of the Great Resignation. I got a better job. I was able to find a job that better suited my skills. I was a web developer. Now I'm building power transmission lines for green energy or what have you. So people are pretty optimistic about their own situation. They're able to get better jobs. They have more power to bargain with employers. But we don't have this concentrated misery that we had after the last recession, where there was 10% unemployment in the midterm, and people who were out of the workforce for care duties, who got laid off near retirement, who are disabled, who are black, these people were facing discrimination and having trouble getting back into the job market and had very sour prospects. So I think this really did help Democrats win a lot of key races.
Now, it would appear, I mean, referring back to Trump's endorsement of failed candidates in the midterms, it would appear some pundits have been saying that the US electorate is tiring of Trumpian rhetoric. Now, what opportunities does this tiring of the right-wing populist rhetoric of Donald Trump open for left-wing or the left wing in US politics, such as the Bernie Sanders Our Revolution movement?
Well, I think people are pretty tired of these sort of distracting cultural moral panics. For instance, the Republican nominee for Senate in New Hampshire, Don Bolduc, he suggested that, quote, furries and fuzzies, kids identifying as furries and fuzzies, were asking to use the litter box at school instead of the bathroom. This is just the sort of things that are in the right-wing fever swamps, and they've been come out into the mainstream a lot. I mean, if you read Rick Perlstein's book, this has been happening for a long time, but it's very clear that these people are not focused on the cost of rent, the cost of everyday groceries and so forth, and they don't have serious plans to help people. So I think voters are looking for someone who offers clear plans about what they're going to do.
And on the subject of those plans, what plans for Sanders, the Sanders camp in the run-up for 2024? Is he going to stand again?
I have no idea.
Really, I mean, he is getting on. He's not as old as President Biden, who is going to turn 80 this weekend. But the actual movement, though, it is still a political platform that will be going forward into the electoral race in 2024. Yes,
a lot of the people that Bernie Sanders endorsed, including Becca Balint for his own former House seat, as well as Maxwell Frost, Greg Casar, Summer Lee, et cetera. These people are going to be in Congress, and some of them will be caucusing informally with the so-called squad, who will put forward a lot of bold policy platforms for a Green New Deal for public housing, Green New Deal for public schools, Green New Deal for energy transition, and so forth. But they will also be able to have a block of votes that can decide whether or not an amendment gets passed.
Okay, so there is a serious structure there in the offering in the run up to 2024. Now, you alluded to it there. Am I correct in saying that one of the main issues that does need to be addressed is the return to bipartisan cooperation across the floor? I mean, is that going to be a key aspect to, let's just say, the various trains that will be leaving the station in the run up to the elections in 2 years' time?
Well, yeah, it will certainly affect the elections in the sense that people will have trouble leaving their seats to go campaign if that could flip control of a chamber.
Sure.
So if we have depends on what the power sharing agreements are, and it depends on how much if Republicans can have a solid enough majority to hold the House of Representatives. They will certainly be, if that happens, they will be using their time to investigate Biden, and I don't expect a lot of bipartisan cooperation. I think that for that to happen, you need Democratic control of both chambers.
Okay. Yeah, that indeed makes sense. Now, looking towards here we are in France, here in Paris, and this is indeed Paris perspective, with France for Bernie, who you are an activist with here in the French capital. Who does the Bernie Sanders, or who in French politics does the Bernie Sanders movement most identify with in French politics? Would it be the more mainstream Parti Socialiste? Would it be the far left France Insoumise of Jean-Luc Mélenchon? Or would it even be someone like Fabien Roussel of the Communist Party? Who in French politics does the movement identify with most?
It's actually interesting because if you flip that around and see who is claiming affiliation with Bernie, it's actually quite the whole spectrum of the left. You had Ian Brossat used a poster that was very similar to Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's campaign poster in 2019 for the Europeans. And he said, I believe, quote, "Bernie Sanders, ça me va," when challenged by a socialist saying, "Oh, you're a socialist now." So it seems very clear that the broad French left does like Bernie Sanders and sort of wants to identify with him. But on the flip side, it's harder to pick a side.
Apart, yeah.
There are definitely a lot of disagreements among the activists here in France. There was some help with the NUPES because
coalition, yes.
It was easy for our affiliated sister organization DSA in France to endorse NUPES, but broadly speaking, there's a lot of disagreement about who to support.
Okay, well, I mean, you have put a good context on it there. That you can say that the main left wing bloc within the NUPES coalition are looking more to the Sanders campaign rather than the other way around, and that is very interesting. Now, this year was an election year here in France, and it went down to the wire. We had Mélenchon, who kind of, let's say, he came in third place, and there was talk of him maybe getting the prime ministership. From how the campaigns were run here in France, what were there, or were there any takeaways from the presidential elections here in France for Bernie and the movement?
Well, I think the main takeaway is that the left does better when they're united, and in the U.S. we sort of have one party that's before, in many countries you make the coalitions after the election. Here in the U.S. we make it before the election. And you can say that, in the midterms in states where the Democratic Party was very united, for instance, in Michigan, where the number 2 person in the state house will be a DSA member with this new session, the Democratic Party did very well. In New York, for instance, where the Democrats were fighting each other, in particular, the state party was going after endorsed people who received the nomination, for instance, for mayor of Buffalo. The party did very poorly. So I think one takeaway is that the left should try to stay united.
Yeah, united we stand, divided we fall. Thank you very much, Max Dunitz, activist with France for Bernie and former left-wing presidential candidate Bernie Sanders, Our Revolution movement. Thank you for being on Paris Perspective today.
Thanks for having me.
And thank you for joining us on today's edition of Paris Perspective. We should be back in about 10 days' time with our next edition. And remember, you can get all of our previous episodes of Paris Perspective on rfienglish.com/podcast, and indeed wherever you get your podcasts. Talk to you soon.